like to welcome everybody to today's Medical Alley webinar on global regulatory and reimbursement issues. We are here today courtesy of the Government of Quebec and Investissement Quebec, who are presenting this information. Our presenters come from NAMSA, the world's leading medtech contract research organization offering global end-to-end development services. So could you ask for better presenters? Just as a quick housekeeping note, actually two of them. One, if you have questions throughout the presentation today, please provide them through the Q&A option here on Zoom. That's how we'll be able to see them, moderate them, and we will plan to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. In addition, this is being recorded today. So if you would like to rewatch this at any point or share this with colleagues, please know that this will be posted on our YouTube channel within the next week or so. So now I'd like to thank and introduce our sponsors, Invest Quebec, represented today by International Affairs Specialist Rachel Benville.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everyone. So I am Rachel Benville from Investissement Quebec, international governmental agency of the Quebec government. So this webinar is the first of this new series with our partner Medical Alley. With the Quebec delegation in Chicago, we are proud to partner with Medical Alley for this second year in the goal of fostering the ties between Quebec and Minnesota and to develop the expertise of Quebec companies on the US market. So stay tuned since we will have more activities coming up with our partner in the coming months. And thanks to be here and enjoy.
Thanks, Rachel. All right, so now to introduce our speakers, our second speaker today will be Joe Sierra talking about reimbursement. He provides guidance and direction to healthcare companies with respect to reimbursement and health economics for medical technologies. His experience draws from building market access programs and value-based healthcare and communicating health economic benefits to key stakeholders. He's held leadership positions at multinational medical device enterprises as well as startup companies. He also maintains a position as an adjunct instructor at the University of Southern California. But our first presenter today will be Kirk Honor. He has over 30 years of medical device technology and entrepreneurial business experience in electrophysiology, cardiovascular, peripheral vascular, urology, and hospital capital equipment. He's been involved with bringing over a dozen medical devices from concept to market by providing tactical and strategic regulatory affairs leadership for multiple medical device companies, including Ecolab, St. Jude, American Medical Systems, and Collagen Corporation. Kirk has built and supported numerous U.S. international regulatory submissions, new product development strategies, and financial market assessments. So from here, please take it away, Kirk.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here. So hopefully that's working. All right. So I'm going to give you guys a presentation talking about how to enter the United States market. The United States Food and Drug Administration's mission is to protect and promote public health in the United States. This mission embraces bringing new medical device technology to the market as efficiently as possible by streamlining regulations and reducing unnecessary burdens associated with FDA's regulatory activities, while upholding stringent standards of review and scientific integrity. The following slides present an overview of the regulatory processes used to bring medical technology products from concept to commercialization in the United States. So basically, like almost all countries, medical devices are categorized in based on their risk to the end user. So low risk in the United States is class 1, medium to moderate risk is class 2, and high risk are class 3 devices. So we're going to look at it from the lowest class devices to the higher risk devices. So a class 1 device actually might be exempt from any kind of filing. You can gain market access by sort of self-certifying, as it were, that the device type is is in a category that doesn't require any filings. If it's a higher risk device or it has certain exceptions, then a class 2 device known as a 510K filing is required. And this is a filing made to the FDA, and you're showing that your device is substantially equivalent to a predicate device. So it's a chain of evidence process where you point backwards to an earlier version of the same device with the same type of indication. Now, there are certain lower risk devices that might not have a pre-existing predicate. A lot of software as a medical device types of devices are now getting into this category. But certain other devices, maybe you have a coating on your device and it's a combination product with no predicate, but it's still the main device utilization is lower risk, not life supporting or sustaining. Then there's this process called Novo, which is it's a larger filing than a 510K, but after you go through it, the future filings can point back to it as a predicate device. So it's a way of basically entering a new class 2 device into the US market. Then there are two class 3 kinds of devices. One is the humanitarian use exemption device, and that's for patient populations of less than 8,000 patients per year in the US. You can qualify for that kind of filing. And then there's the highest risk regular class 3 pre-market approval application. This kind of device is going to be the highest amount of regulatory scrutiny that your devices are going to undergo. So what we have here are your controls, your quality management system. And in the United States, there are things called general controls and special controls, and those are those are specific regulations for your devices that the FDA publishes. Then you have clinical data that might be required in order to gain market entry. So the lowest class devices, the class 1 devices, they generally do not need any evidence of clinical information. They generally do have to have some quality systems in place, specifically design controls and some other minor systems. As you go up in risk, the amount of regulatory oversight in the controls that you have in your quality management system increase. And then as you go up further, you'll probably need clinical data to support the safety and efficacy of the device. And when you're in the class 3 category, you almost always will need clinical data to support that application. There's a nuance in the terminology. When you're a class 2 device, you're cleared to market. When you're a class 3 device, you're approved to market. And you can use those words in your marketing and labeling and promotions. So how do you interact with the FDA? So in order to figure out where you are in this process, the first thing you need to do is basic assessment and regulatory research on the device and indication that you're developing, and then formulating a regulatory strategy around that assessment. And this can be done for all countries, internationally, but in the United States, all medical devices are going to fall into one of these classes. Once you have that completed, then you can start interacting with the FDA basically immediately and for free by doing pre-submissions. And there are a bunch of different kinds. You can do a real quick introduction to your technology, and then you can do subsequent pre-submissions to gain information from FDA about how they're going to view the data and evidence that you have for your device, and what requirements that they're going to have the company meet in order to enter the US market. And so you go through this process, you gain a lot of information about exactly what hurdles the FDA might put in your way, but you also understand what expectations the FDA has in order for you to enter the market. And with that understanding, is when you make those expectations in the evidence that you generate, that helps smooth the path to a filing that the FDA, you sort of have an idea that the FDA will agree to clearing or approving the device based on the prior communications with the agency. So once you get through the pre-subs, there might be a possibility that you need to do an investigational device exemption filing. If your device needs a clinical trial that's significant risk, then you need to do an investigational device exemption filing to gain approval for that clinical trial and to generate that clinical data. So the process takes some time to generate the evidence. The 510K, a lot of people say, well, that's a 90-day review. It's statutory. Congress says you have to do that in 90 days. And FDA does take 90 days by and large to review documents sent as 510Ks. But they also have a clock stop function. And so after about 75 days, they generally send you a bunch of questions and they'll give you 180 days to reply. And they're very good at deducing what questions will take 180 days to reply to. So, just to keep in mind that those statutory times are FDA review times, but they have a clock stop function. There are some costs to doing the actual files. So the pre-subs are all free, but once you file for a market access, depending on whether or not you're a large company or a small company, and foreign entities can apply for small business discounts through a separate process. You have to do that before you file, but you can save a little bit of money. So 510Ks are about 13,000. De Novo is 112,000, and then the PMA is 375,000 US dollars. So FDA determines the intended use of the device by looking at not just the information for use and the intended use labeling, but also looks at the labeling claims, advertising material, and oral and written statements that the company might have on their website or other advertising materials. And this evidence sort of is what FDA views as indications. And as such, they have the authority essentially to regulate it, even though there's no specific regulation promulgated regarding promotional activities. So one thing that companies should do, and this is a requirement for the EU as well, but I'm only addressing the United States side of it, is that you need to market, you need to capture the claims that you have and make sure that they're supported in the evidence that you're generating. So again, low-class devices, low-risk class devices have lower requirements than higher risk class devices. So yeah, the class 1 device, you should have post-market surveillance in place, but the class 2, you need additional evidence in place and getting updated on an ongoing basis, not necessarily annually, but on a regular basis to make sure that the claims that you're making are being supported by evidence. Then, of course, the class 3 devices, they have an ongoing marketing reports that are required by the FDA on an annual basis. Couple special areas. The FDA has access to special designations. The breakthrough device and the safer technology programs are two pre-submissions that can be made by companies to request these designations for their device technology. And basically, they give the company an intermediate goal and sort of something that they can, if they choose, they can let people know about, that their device has been granted a breakthrough designation or a safer designation. And there's some benefit on the functional side of interacting with the FDA if one of these is granted to the company, in that the FDA will enhance interactions with the company and provide additional resources to try to speed the overall review path timeline internally at FDA for these devices. The main difference is the breakthroughs are generally for life-threatening conditions, where the safer are slightly less serious devices that can enhance slightly less serious problems with the device. And NAMSA has a lot of help in this area, so we provide services across the board. At the end of the day, COVID aside, they've been focused on that. But FDA is open for business, and they have been throughout the pandemic. And I just want to state that bringing a medical device to market is complex and time-consuming, and every medical device that ultimately is sold in the United States must be developed in compliance with the rules administered by FDA. Using the pre-submission communication tools provide a great way to interact with the FDA and to get their buy-in on your plan to bring your device to market, from a bench testing perspective all the way through clinical and even post-market. So in short, FDA is open for business and NAMSA is ready to assist. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Kirk, for that very informative presentation. Really appreciate it. Give me 1 second here to pull up my slide and talk through what this means from a reimbursement perspective. So like Kirk mentioned, NAMSA provides a wide array of services related to market access, regulatory, and reimbursement. So we're hoping to kind of give you the whole realm here of what it takes. And I've set up here 4 key things to think about related to reimbursement. And we'll start with what reimbursement is. We'll move on to the impact and interplay of regulatory and reimbursement. Some things there that you may not have considered. Clinical trials and data collection considerations, and how important that is to getting reimbursement in the United States. And the importance of stakeholder value propositions. Again, an overlay with kind of regulatory, but with a little bit of a different standard and a little bit of extra work that manufacturers may need to look at when looking at how they deploy in the United States. So let's define reimbursement, and we'll talk about the 3 key factors of reimbursement strategy that are discussed in the industry. My working definition of reimbursement is that reimbursement is a standardized process by which a healthcare provider, a medical facility, or other appropriate care entity receives remuneration in exchange for goods or services from a payer or government. Okay, that's a pretty good working global definition that I've been working off of for a while now. And how do we know that reimbursement has been achieved? Well, reimbursement is achieved when there's 3 market conditions. And again, this is assuming that you have regulatory approval, which goes into the coverage piece. But the 3 conditions of a reimbursement strategy are coverage, coding, and payment. Coverage is about who the product or service is covered for and under which circumstances. Coding is kind of like the language of the reimbursement process. It includes the diagnosis codes and things like that that go into unlocking reimbursement for a particular product or service. And then payment, which is the amount of money that's, again, remunerated and paid out to the provider. But it also refers to the different rules and intricacies and policies around the actual payment piece. So if your product has these three elements, generally in the market that you're going into, then you do have reimbursement. But if you don't, then you need to look at them individually and see what you can do to overcome them. So let's go over some fast facts about the reimbursement structure in the United States. The U.S. healthcare system is basically a series of payers and providers, okay, where patients are covered by payers and they work with different providers. So a payer or a health insurer or a government payer is responsible for insurance payment and to providers in exchange for insurance premiums from customers. So consumers pay for insurance, and that money is then reimbursed as a procedure is done or a product is delivered to the providers, with usually some sort of cost sharing for the patient consumer. What is a provider? So you may be thinking, well, a provider, we're talking about a doctor or a hospital, right? Well, a provider, for the purposes of reimbursement in the United States, can be a little bit more broad of a definition. It can include your traditional hospitals, clinics, and other facilities. It can include your offices, right? But it also includes places like retail clinics. We have retail clinics in the United States. It also includes device providers and device distributors. It can also include pharmaceutical distributors and retail pharmacies. Those are all different providers, and they have a place in the system. So when we think about providers, it's not just about the doctor. It's also about the other mechanisms of care delivery. For a little bit of context, in the United States, there's hundreds of millions of people that are covered by private insurance, and there are just under 100 million people in each of Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare, I'll talk about in the next slide, but we're talking about, in general, access to hundreds of millions of people with some sort of coverage. There are over 1,000 private insurance plans in the United States, and that includes the multiple lines of business within payers. So different payers have different products, and each one of those counts as, really, they're kind of operated as their own payer structure in some ways, with their own rules. One distinguishing factor of reimbursement in the United States versus potentially some other countries is the standardized claims processing procedure that was instituted under HIPAA. And both the government payers and private insurance all use the same forms in order to conduct reimbursement transactions. So, a form for reimbursement to Medicare will look the same as one that's submitted to private insurance. And in fact, there are electronic systems that are shared by multiple different payers as well. So that's the one piece I would say that makes the system a little bit more cohesive compared to all of the distinct parts of the system. So that's at least one thing that's unifying. Really quickly, for those that are not familiar with Medicare, private insurance, and Medicaid, as I had mentioned before, these three general types of insurance in the United States cover hundreds of millions of people. Medicare is run by the U.S. federal government. It's a federal government program. It's administered by a couple of private contractors, but it is the rules and the budget and so forth is handled by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services up in Baltimore. And they are a very influential payer in the United States because they are the health insurance for people that are 65 and over, or disabled, or have chronic kidney disease, and a bunch of other disease states as well. So this is federal government funded. we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 million people, and primarily for people age 65 or over. Private insurance is generally what most people have in the United States in terms of percentage of insured people. Hundreds of millions of people are covered. Some of the large private insurers include United Healthcare, you may have heard of, Aetna, Cigna, Humana, Blue Cross. Those are all examples of private insurance plans. And typically those plans are funded by groups of people or through the Affordable Care Act, which is a subsidy from, or what some people have called Obamacare, which pays for private insurance for individuals through these programs. And also a little bit of, or mostly employers, actually. Employers are probably the biggest purchaser of private insurance. And then Medicaid is a state-run payer program, and each state has their own rules and regulations about how that program is run. But generally, it's for people who meet a specific income threshold. So it's meant for people that may not qualify for private insurance. They may not be able to qualify for the Affordable Care Act subsidies, and they don't qualify for Medicare. So they probably qualify for Medicaid. And there's other municipal plans too, which you could classify as private insurance, basically. But there's no shortage of health insurance in the United States, that's for sure. So now that we understand kind of the lay of the land, let's quickly jump into the importance of clinical trials and data collection. Okay. Going back to the reimbursement strategy, coverage, coding, and payment, product launch teams should proactively think about and identify an initial point of view addressing coverage, coding, and payment with respect to their data collection activities and the way that they design their products. And then subject that to what we would call payer research or testing and validation processes. So for example, when we're looking at coverage, many of the insurers that are in the United States specify what they cover and what they don't cover in what's called a medical policy document. And so what you would like to do is, if there's a similar product to what you have, you want to try to find policies that refer to that similar product and see what are the criteria that the payer accepts coverage for. It may be very stringent, it may be very open, and that will help you to understand if you're going to, how you're going to meet your commercial goals during your product launch. It's also a critical way to look at supporting evidence. You want to understand clinical evidence because that is a big decision-making factor for payers. What about coding? What type of code do you fit into? Do you fit into a device code like HCPCS? Do you fit into a device that's sort of like a procedure like ICD-10 PCS or CPT? Each of these are stratified by different sites of service. For example, there's some codes that are used in hospitals that are not used in an outpatient setting or an outpatient clinic or in a physician's office. There's certain codes that are respective to categories of products that people take home in their homes. There's codes for pharmaceuticals that people either mail order or they go to the local pharmacy and pick up. So how you fit into those really is defined by how you structure your product and its indications and its intended use and a lot of other factors that you're considering in your design. And then payment, going back to payment. How much does this thing actually get paid for? And what does that look like to each site of service, and how does it look like for each provider? Because that's going to be a factor in the economic overview of the product or service. For people that are looking at digital health and medical devices as software as medical device, this coding piece and coverage piece are very, very critical to understand and something that you want to get into very early on. Another good list, I would say, is the top 3 considerations for reimbursement and regulatory perspectives combined together. Number 1, this is just based on having gone through dozens of product launches and and helping clients with a wide array of services and technologies. It is critical for there to be a cost-effective data collection to address FDA criteria. But the key question is, can these data collection efforts also address reimbursement goals, right? So in other words, what can we do to enhance reimbursement when we're looking at our data collection efforts for, de novo or PMA, like Kirk was talking about? Is it even possible? Is it something that could be like could it be included in that trial, or could it be something that's looked at later on in another way? And there's a lot of different solutions for that. Reimbursement should be looped into the fold, meaning, the product development process early and often to understand how the product or service fits into the space and to avoid pitfalls. You may think that you fit into a particular reimbursement classification based on what you know about your regulatory pathway. But sometimes if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, sometimes it's an orange. And that's sometimes how it works with reimbursement, unfortunately. You want to make sure that you look at that very, very closely. And it's really critical. Things don't always end up the way that they seem on the surface when it comes to reimbursement. And payers in the United States frequently reference indications for use in their decision-making for defining the coverage policy, like we talked about before, right? So, that's going to be, I would say, kind of an anchor point for payers when they're deciding about whether to cover something or not, and for whom. Because remember, they're managing a gigantic population of millions of people. They want to know, from a budget standpoint, from a clinical impact standpoint, what is the population? Is there enough data to support the use in that population from an efficacy standpoint, and then even sometimes from an economic standpoint? One thing I would like to note in the statement is you may be surprised that it says that the coverage decision from a payer is usually for a population that is smaller than the regulatory indication. That does happen quite a bit, where for example, you may have a regulatory indication for all people with type 2 diabetes over the age of 18 or something like that. But based on the available clinical evidence for your product, or the guidelines that are put out by professional medical societies, or the payer's own assessment of the data, sometimes they say, yeah, you know what, that's great that you have that indication, but we're only going to pay for it for this particular group because that's where most of the data is proved out. So something to consider there as well. Some other factors, I'm not going to go through every one of them here, but just want to list off the considerations. The product lifespan. There are laws and regulations in place which could impact whether or not the product is reimbursed. And yes, whether or not is really what we meant to say there, because there are certain aspects of how long a product lasts that could impact things like if you're going for reimbursement as a durable medical equipment product. Product use case. So understanding the site of service. Understanding that reimbursement could be different from one site of service to the other. Understanding the mechanism of action for the product. That's very important. Product launch timing. So if you have a commercial plan set up and you have your regulatory and your V&V and everything else just kind of, lined up, and then Kirk says, hey, you know what? We're going to have your PMA done in, by the end of year 2, we expect, assuming that all goes well. And that happens to fall in August of 2024 or something like that. Well, unfortunately, there may be some windows that were missed from a reimbursement perspective, because the process for obtaining reimbursement codes is on a set date basis across procedure and HCPCS codes. So it's certainly something that can delay, the model a little bit if that kind of information isn't triangulated. The proposed indications for use. We talked about the indicated population, the instructions for use, the package insert. Sometimes they can conflict with the market that you're looking for. So you want to make sure that's aligned, and that the study that you're doing or the pro code that you're getting cleared under is aligned with where you want to go from a market access standpoint, right? existing clinical evidence. If there's a lot of negative clinical evidence about your product or your category of product, how do you overcome that? Is there some sort of action that can be taken in advance in data collection or in objection handling with stakeholders? And then the clinical and economic burden, which is, I think that everyone who's working on a product understands what the unmet need concept is, but sometimes there's quite a demanding standard for what an economic unmet need and the impact of a device could do. So what I mean by that is that a payer may want a very high scientific level of evidence on economic data, depending on what you're asking for. And they may want, repeated multiple data points. So, this doesn't mean that like everybody has to run out and do 16 randomized control trials for their device. It doesn't mean that you have to go buy millions of dollars of insurance claims data and then, do it all in 1 year. That's not at all. This is more of like a progressive set of steps, but you want to know what those steps are in advance to set expectations appropriately. A little bit more on data collection and clinical trials, kind of foraying off of the last two bullet points there. The way we like to look at how reimbursement and regulatory kind of vector together is in three sort of timeframes: the now, the near, and the far. And I have to credit my colleague, Dr. Dan Lace, for coming up with that great way of expressing it. And what we're saying here is really that there's ways to engage with reimbursement in a stepwise fashion, along with your data collection strategy and your regulatory pathway. And why is it important to think about reimbursement at these stages? So in the now stage, like right now, if you haven't thought about reimbursement, and you're going for stuff like external funding, and people are asking, what is your commercial pathway and what is your thought process on reimbursement if it's possible? This provides some clarity on that direction if you can get an idea of where that pathway is at the beginning, right? Then the interplay with regulatory, how do you take something very meaningful like getting breakthrough status and helping that in the reimbursement process? Can you get reimbursement if you're going for an IDE? What is the speed to coding and to reimbursement coverage and payment, depending on whether you have a 510K or PMA or whatever process you're going through? If you don't have a lot of data for your product, what are the implications for coverage objections from payers? So thinking about this will align your product and your commercial vision, and it will help to manage those pitfalls that you may run into as you go along. You can at least have a plan for it. Moving beyond kind of like the initial regulatory piece, reimbursement comes into play in the US for your clinical data strategy as well. You may want to look at collecting more data, whether it's through another trial or preferably a randomized control trial, or a data collection registry or something like that, or investing in health economic data. This, as you continue to perhaps expand your regulatory indications and continue to expand your market access, can help with adoption, particularly prescriber adoption and consumer access to the product. Because the more evidence that you have, the easier it is for a payer who's reviewing your product for clinical evidence to say, you know what, we see 3 or 4 trials about this product and they're fairly recent and it looks good. And study optimization, study design optimization. This sort of thing can prevent delays in market access, future milestones, because what can happen is there can be reactive action taken by a payer further down the road. If you are very successful with your product, they see utilization going up, they're spending more money for it. The more tight and well designed your trials are, especially as you progress through the product life cycle, the more ROI you're going to get, and the better proactive engagement you're going to have with payers. And I know we're running right up on time, so I'm just going to quickly go through this last piece, which is the impact of the value proposition. So one important distinguishing factor about the United States payers is that, in general, they have a much shorter view of what they consider to be most valuable in terms of clinical and economic benefits. Okay. And the reason for this is because, like we had mentioned before, the majority of consumers that have health insurance are in employer-sponsored plans, meaning from when they go from employer to employer, they may have a different insurance plan. Okay. So as people change jobs, they're moving on to another plan. And in fact, there was one study that showed that roughly a third of people on private insurance switch plans on I believe a 2 to 3 year basis or something like that. I think it was a 3-year time window. 33% of people change plans. So that's why a lot of payers are focused on sort of the near term, and why it's a lot different than when you would see in what some refer to as single payer markets, where we're looking at a longer time horizon, and we're looking at, more of a utilitarian approach to evaluating whether something's covered or not, a more holistic approach. In the US, it's a much shorter time horizon. So the best thing that you can do to kind of ensure that you're ready for this is to make sure that you have a reimbursement toolkit that's triangulated with your regulatory claims matrix, which is, what Kirk had recommended previously, and value messaging that's targeted to stakeholders. It has to be specific to the United States due to the unique nature of the healthcare system structure and processes. And thankfully, there's a lot of good data out there, but you may have to kind of do some more legwork and investment to make something really compelling. Clearly articulate the indicated population. So think about things from the payer's standpoint. Again, they have hundreds of millions of patients. They're getting insurance premiums on a monthly basis. The payer may look at how much your technology is taking away from those premiums on a per patient per month basis. And then that is scaled down by the population that you are asking to get coverage for. Okay. So if it's a very big population and your service costs $100 per patient per month, then we're talking about something in the orders of millions of dollars. But if it's a very small population and you're looking to, gradually get into the space, you can have a lot more. It can be received, I think, a lot differently than saying that we want coverage for every single person under the sun. And then be open to partnerships and be prepared for intensive exchanges of data and discussion of evidence. So once you start talking to payers, you want to make sure that you have your data in order, that you have your clinical evidence in order and a plan to move forward, because payers are very open to working with manufacturers in general, which is great, depending on what kind of product it is. And again, which mechanism you're fitting into from a coding and payment perspective. Sometimes there's not much that you can do because of the nature of the system, but if you're in the right spot, you want to be able to harness that opportunity. So just wanted to say that, myself and my team are open to chat with any of you. All you have to do is drop an email to me. We're happy to jump in a call with your team to talk about any of these things or anything that might be specific to your product's needs. Always enjoy doing that. We work with large and small companies, and really enjoy having these types of discussion because it's exciting, to see great products and services come to market from a regulatory and reimbursement perspective. So thanks everybody for the time. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you both. This was outstanding information. I think obviously, even though we have two speakers today, one of the biggest takeaways is that these items should not be thought of as different or, one after the other, but really in conjunction in a parallel process. So just wanted to say that we're starting to get some questions in, which is great. So again, that Q&A portal. The most common question thus far has been if you guys can share your slides via PDF, and we have said that yes, we can do that. So just know, everyone, that these will be available after the presentation. All right, so getting into the meat of the questions that we have, the first says, please share your view on any trends with payers related to real-world evidence versus RCT.
Yeah, so I'll start, and then Kirk, feel free to jump in from from your angle as well. So certainly, from a payers' perspective, when they think of real world evidence, you're thinking about something that they can model in their own data that they have. Okay, so you can bring forward, real world data, and you're going to be met more than likely with objections about the different biases associated with this, particularly selection bias and other sorts of problems with design. So if you can get through the hurdle of the problems with design and come through with a clear hypothesis about, again, being very specific about what population you're talking about, not trying to say like, hey, we have this great data and, therefore it's going to, we want to open up coverage policies to the world. It definitely has applicability. I've seen payer policies change from real world evidence, so it can make an impact. But at the end of the day, there's still some payers and organizations that really highly value high grade evidence, randomized controlled trials, or at least some sort of comparative, well-designed trial with a sufficient study population n size, a sufficient study period, meaning like more than 2 weeks, want to do something like, several months at least, and a comparator arm in some way. So, and the other thing I would say is when you're structuring real world evidence, you want to make it look as much like an RCT as possible when you do the analysis. Kirk, do you have anything to add? I mean, it is applicable to regulatory too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of what you just said is just, could be duplicated for FDA interactions. I'd say that the one caveat is that you can do pre-sub discussions with FDA on real world evidence to see if they will find it acceptable to support a submission. And I've done that with a lot of clients, that they have studies, they have evidence. Maybe it wasn't randomized clinical trial, and more likely it was, but it wasn't conducted in the United States. So they want to use this evidence, and I think FDA is definitely open to it. But you have the benefit of discussing it with them ahead of time before you submit it.
Excellent. So the next question is: are you seeing value-based contracts expanding?
Yes, and you want to make sure that you have, again, your real world evidence and your data ready for that discussion. I've had the privilege of working on a couple of really pivotal ones in the medtech space, and and they have really changed the landscape. And what I do also see a lot of is companies that want to dive right into it, but may not have all the cards ready to be successful in that. Because the way that these value-based deals are done with payers is, the payers see some potential, and they're going to give you access to a great amount of resources and time on their end, which is a great thing. And so, you want to make sure that you have everything ready to have that conversation. And sometimes the preparation piece takes a long time. But what I've also learned is that the execution phase and the follow-up also is quite intensive on both sides, because typically in those sorts of agreements, you have to have a meeting of the minds on what is value, what is the exchange on both sides, what is the performance that's needed, what's the outcome that's needed, what does that trigger, what's an acceptable range of error. A lot of those things come up, and you have to be ready to address them.
All right, thank you. All right, so the next question is really around cost of getting through the reimbursement pathway. So I'll read it more or less as it's written. It just says, how much does it cost roughly to do the first research on reimbursement pathways for a startup company, or the first research on the convergence and coding to ensure that the product developed will be covered and have a code?
Yeah, and again, I'll make sure, Kirk, you have you'll probably have something to add to this as well. But what I would say is that you first have to know kind of, I would say not first, but in parallel, you need to know where you're going from a regulatory perspective, because that is such a high factor in reimbursement. Your indications for use, your labeling, your product code, those are all things that are considered very much so. So it can be done independently, I think, if you have a theory, but it may not be as useful if you don't also have an appropriate view from a validated view on the regulatory side. Now, as far as like, the cost goes, I mean, it depends on how validated you want to be. At NAMSA, we take a full coverage coding and payment lens on everything. And I would argue that that's what you want. I mean, obviously, I work for NAMSA, but like in general, reimbursement, if you want to make sure coverage coding and payment are addressed. And like I had mentioned previously, you may also want to make sure there's enough resources to validate that with things like payer research, or even just getting one-off gut checks from payer stakeholders, either current or former ones. So it can be as lean as you want it to be within reason. It's just the issue just is, the error bars in terms of the outcomes, go up a lot if you're trying to trim it down. But Kirk, do you want anything to add to that on the regulatory side?
Yeah. So I think this is a particular area that startup companies have higher burden than an existing company. So you have to, as Joe said, understand the regulatory sort of location of the device, and that's generally based on your indication. But the hurdle is there for startups. In terms of cost, it's definitely based on how long it's going to take, right? So the more innovative the product is, it might take longer to figure out specifically both sides of this equation.
Yeah, and just a little hint on the cost too. I mean, because again, like we don't want to throw numbers out there, but like the people that have worked at payers previously, or that have worked at CMS, they're up there in terms of their consulting value, as high as a lawyer or something like that. I mean, it's very similar in that way. But with that being said, you want to have a partner that is willing to work with you on where you are in your commercialization process. There's just some limits to it. That's all. So
that makes sense. I think with some regularity here at Medical Alley, we get questions like, FDA provides a discount for small businesses. Do consultants do the same? So I think that's maybe where part of these kinds of questions are coming from. And certainly that's very much up to the relationship that you develop with that company and what their needs are, I think. So we have another question here, and I'm probably going to pronounce one of the words wrong, but it says, what is the current reimbursement status of unlisted multi-analyte assay with algorithmic analysis? So CPT code 81599, any difference in coverage between private payers and Medicare?
Wow. I feel like if I don't get
that's
this
for
right,
you,
then,
Joe. That's your question there.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly many CPT codes. Not knowing too much about that particular policy. That is, first of all, it's an unlisted code, and so unlisted codes typically are going to go through kind of like a case by case sort of process, with a few exceptions. So as far as the reimbursement status of that particular one code, I would have to look into it more to come back to you on that. If you want to reach out to me, just shoot me an email, or any of us an email, and we'll figure it out for you. But as far as the difference between private payers and Medicare, one thing to keep in mind about that sort of let's say procedure code, even though it's more of like a diagnostic, basically, Medicare has its own pricing structure for that. It's subject to a lot of different, rules and regulations. It has its own payment policies, has its own coverage policies. Private payers will reference it. They'll look at it. It'll certainly be a guiding factor as to whether they cover it or not. But what I would say is that there's usually more flexibility on the private payer side for these types of, 99 codes or miscellaneous codes. If you have the right sort of reimbursement structure set up, if you have the right provider partnerships and the right provider pathway, and you have the evidence in order. I mean, in order to get a new CPT code, there has to be, some sort of demonstration that it's needed, and that can come in the way of people using, a 99 code a lot, for example. That could be one justification. So, the use of it could be a precursor to something, positive further down the line. So don't know the specific policy on that particular code, but based on my spidey senses, I would say with the 99 unlisted, it's probably going to be quite a review and arduous process for most payers. A little bit more documentation, and the payment might be quite varied.
All right. Well, if anybody else has questions, feel free to submit them. But I have one myself that I'm curious if you guys would be willing to address. We've been working with quite a few startups in the remote patient monitoring, telehealth, digital health space lately. And I know the codes there are not as clean cut, or maybe folks are wondering if they can fit their innovation under something existing, something like a digital instead of an imaging, those kinds of things. So just out of your opinion, what is the future for some of those reimbursement opportunities for digital health and remote patient monitoring?
Yeah, I'll say a few things, and then Kirk, if you want to chime in on the overall commercial. So the codes that are out there in general for remote patient monitoring itself have they have like highly varied payments. And the definitions and use of them from a payment policy and coding perspective are also widely varied. So for example, there may be a remote patient monitoring code that is billed by one provider and for that one patient. And then if it's billed again by another provider for that patient, that second claim may be denied because of the way that the systems are set up and the way that the policies are set up. Recently with COVID, of course, a lot of the restrictions on traditionally face-to-face services have shifted to telehealth. So that's another piece, is if the service is similar to an existing procedure that's done traditionally face-to-face, then there may be an opportunity there. And there certainly was. A notable example would be speech therapy, occupational therapy codes that were, and I believe might still be, I don't know the last time I checked, but I believe that payers such as Medicare, some private payers have kind of, let that idea out of Pandora's box, so to speak. So the genie is kind of out on that one. And I think that payers and Medicare are trying to put it back in, which is, understandable. You have to understand that prior to COVID, remote anything was very, very difficult to obtain reimbursement for, unless it was in specific circumstances, such as an underrepresented area from like a provider standpoint or something like that. So things have changed. In my discussions with payers, they are open to working with manufacturers about how to make that work. If it's something that fits into a procedure like an implanted thing, it's a little bit different. So there's definitely opportunity there. There are a lot of opportunities coming up with CPT coding that address this as well, with some of the ways that the American Medical Association is looking at things. So that's just something to think about there. And Kirk, certainly implications from regulatory side as well, right?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of data that's getting generated by devices these days that there are a lot of implications. I know the question was regarding reimbursement, but when you're developing those kinds of devices, you have to keep in mind the data security aspects are pretty onerous, and you have to have systems in place to make sure that the data is being captured and handled properly for compliance reasons. And then, the FDA is looking at this, looking at these data sets as data sources that they can review. So as you go into post-market, you want to make sure that you're sort of lined up with what really needs to be looked at and sort of submitted. So you can think of like a cardiac pacemaker. They have this class 3 device. A lot of them now have direct communication with the patient. iPhone is being uploaded continuously versus like a Withings scale that tells you how much you weigh and what your BMI is. Pretty divergent kinds of information, but all related to your health. So FDA's, I think from a regulatory perspective, it's just definitely you want to keep in mind that data security requirements are probably the key thing at this point.
It's a great point. Also from a commercial perspective, having been director of sales for a company that does that, has that, I mean, you got to be able to make it through you got to pass the test from a data security perspective as well. Just reimbursement and regulatory aside, like, you're going to have a hard time with hospitals if you don't have that taken care of.
Certainly. Well, we are over time here, but I have one last question that I think could probably be just like a yes, no, but I'll take your opinion on that. Just basically says, any thoughts on whether guaranteed CMS reimbursement for breakthrough will resume?
Yeah, we get this question a lot. We actually wrote a blog about it. Rebecca Langquist from my team wrote a great article about it on the NAMSA website that I encourage everybody to check out. And the answer is, we'll see. That's sorry to be, and I know that's like a vague answer, but like, I think just the way that it's been run in the past has been a challenge. And so, there's definitely a reevaluation that needs to happen. What I've learned about CMS is that things don't necessarily just go away. So, either positively or negatively. So will it be exactly the same? I don't know, but that's a great question and appreciate it.
Well, it sounds like we need to send the link to that blog post out with the slides. So thank you both today. This was a really fantastic discussion. Great questions from the participants. And thank you again to Quebec for sponsoring this opportunity. And again, folks, if you have additional questions, please feel free to get in contact with Joe or with Kirk. NAMSA is a great member here for Medical Alley and partner to us for these kinds of questions. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday.